You guys ready for another night of transportation talks? Yeah. A couple of housekeeping issues or concerns that I want to bring up. The attendance sheet is going around, so please sign your name. Also, we're doing name tags now, so I can get your names. And so floating around, there's a couple of name tags on each table and pens, so please write your name on there so we can all get to know each other. I see Will, the baby, so tiny, I have the team vision, but really, not everybody. So just write your name loud and clear so we can know each other by name, which I think is sometimes very hard in a class where we only meet each other once a week. One other thing I've noticed in this class, in this room, is the acoustics. It really bounces. So it sometimes appears there's like double or triple amount of people in this room, which is very interesting, but we're also losing some voices and there's a lot of echo, so I just want us to be mindful of each other. But also doing the presenter's presentation. I want to ask how people's week went in terms of a handful of assignments that we put out, and the big one is your project. I want you to remember that your project is due to Thuy and I on the 13th, Friday the 13th, which is tomorrow. So some of you have sent it in to us. I've seen a trickle of some really interesting ideas. We're going to catalog them, but I think it would be really prudent for you to kind of think about as you're listening to these presentations and also doing research for your project for the next upcoming week. So one thing I didn't do today was send out an email to everybody because some of you are not getting my emails, and you are getting serious emails, so most of the emails that I'm sending you will be coming from him also. One thing I do want to mention in the email that most of you did get is please bring food to class. So food is fuel, and fuel for your brain, and water because there's not much. This is a very dry land, yes. But I also want to be mindful, one of the comments I received from last week's class was there's a lot of conversations. We asked a question, perhaps we can generalize the question and not be so specific on some of our issues, but I also want to recognize that that is the spirit of this class. So I just want us to be mindful of each other as we share this space together, and everybody has an opportunity to learn at the same time. We're all in different stages of our lives and different stages of our careers and life and such. So I just want us to be mindful of where we're all stepping into. So those are some of the items I have. I know a couple of questions came up regarding the scavenger hunt game. What we can do is during break, if you have questions, Thuy and I can help answer those questions. I think some folks are having a hard time downloading the PDF and putting pictures up there. One of the ideas that Thuy had proposed was, do you want to mention?
Yeah, just in the PowerPoint, just check mark, like write X, and then if you have a picture, and just like label the picture, like neighborhood and like transportation mode, and then upload that picture separately in your drive. In that way, we know that the picture is there, and then you identify you have the picture like for that particular mode for the particular neighborhood, and then you can write the neighborhood on the PowerPoint itself.
I think making a copy of the PowerPoint into our own folder is the important part also.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was part of the instruction.
Or else what I can do is I can print the page for you to actually manually write, and then once you complete, you can take a picture and then send that to me by email. I can also then put that in your folder. If somebody, that's probably, for some that will be easier, for some that is a more like more steps, but as long as it helps you to, do the work correctly, we are here to accommodate your work.
Yeah, if you want to have a tutorial on Slack, Google Drive, or Scavenger Hunt, we're here during break, so we can help you through it. One of the things I want to bring up is last week's class, unfortunately, did not get captured on video or audio. So if you're looking for that video, it's not there on YouTube. We had some technical difficulties, but from now on, we'll ensure that everything will be recorded and up at least by the following week. So that's what I have. We do have a pretty full agenda tonight. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up? Dave?
I'm having issues finding the specific version of the required readings. Like if I go on the website and I just copy and paste search the listed text from the required readings, there's often more than one option of either different years or the same title for different department.
Do you have access to PSU library?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Would it make sense for us to maybe bring some samples of this books to class?
Yeah,
Let's work on that.
okay.
But yeah, a lot of these textbooks have different versions because many of them are older.
I mean, it's like a list of reports from the Portland website.
Oh, all of those are actually online at PBOT's website or City of Portland, or some of them maybe from the kind of sustainability.
Yes, that's what I'm having trouble finding, like the actual one you want to read, because sometimes there's like several that have similar names.
Okay, let me do a little bit more research, and maybe what we could do is also provide links to the class for those. Would that be helpful? Yes. Reach out to our colleagues. So, any more questions before we start? I want to spend some time towards the end of class. We can talk about our class project and the field trip. So we can say that to the end. We are letting someone into the room. So tonight, we got our long. Yes, thank you. We're going to talk about the history of transportation, but more so the makeup of the city. But for many years when this class has been in session, one of our chief planners for the city of Portland, the retired chief planner Steve Dotterrer, has always been here to talk about the history of transportation. He's always done an amazing job just going through the whole layout of the city and what it's become. It's really like really enthralled. It's listening to this. Tonight we have Steve here with us, but we also have Shawn Canny here with us. And Shawn is a transportation planner with PBOT. And Shawn's gonna share not just the supplemental workings of this history of transportation in our city, but also the racist component of how it's come to be. So a lot of this is, I want to thank you, Judge, for making this happen. So much of this is behind the scenes, all the outreach that we've done for the last few months to bring all the classes together, but especially like tonight's class. So without further ado, I want to bring up Steve. So Steve could, because it's a good one.
That wasn't me.
It wasn't. It's a great one, but it's also a really long one. So I want to make sure we have enough time. If Steve can hold the questions until the end, I think we can.
We can do that, or if people have factual questions,
Yes.
they can raise their hand and I'll deal with them. If you want to debate about something. And I perfectly understand this, you might want to slow things. Okay, so I need to.
Turn the volume of those people who come in down.
Yeah.
We don't interrupt our speakers, and put this on slideshow. And then, do you want to click
I can do it if it's right here.
If it's right there.
Okay, so let me do it in presenter mode.
Nope, no,
That's
this is
right.
not it.
It's the other one.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So I will tell you that this is a presentation that the city first started doing in 1974. So it's been around for a long time. It's a presentation that was first done when we were writing the first version of the
Yeah.
citywide transportation plan. And the idea was to kind of have everyone have a common understanding of the phases of development that the city had gone through. So that's what this presentation is really about. It's just.
Yeah. Oh, wait. It's not-
No, that's not it. There. So, looking at this picture, is it possible to turn the lights down a little bit? Really what this presentation is to talk about is this happens to be a view from Pitt Mansion. You can only see a little there. You can only see a little bit, but not good in the distance. It's really about why the lines of white lights are where they are and how the patterns of the city developed and how it's a combination of both transportation decisions, but also very heavily about land use decisions as well. And to think about it, it's helpful to step way back and to begin to think about when Euro-American settlement first came into this country, into this region, and what modes of transportation were important to them at first. And the thing to say is that it's either horsepower or human power that's moving around, or you're taking advantage of water. And so, since water is less work for the horse than the human, they're looking for places that give them water access to the most different places. And if you look at the Pacific Northwest, the thing to notice about it is that there's the Columbia and the Willamette, and as you can see that the majority of the Pacific Northwest can be reached from that river system. They all knew, even in its early days, that the harbor at Puget Sound was a better harbor for ocean-going vessels. But if you look at it, there's no rivers that lead out of it to get you anywhere else. So that's why somewhere around the intersection of the Willamette and the Columbia was the first place to have settlement. And as you probably all know, it was first Hudson Bay Company, and then American fur traders, and then people coming in to settle. And at first, it wasn't quite clear where at the intersection of these two rivers the community might emerge. So Vancouver at the top emerges an early competitor. You can see Portland, then Lyndon and St. John's, Milwaukee, Oregon City had the advantage of the water power from the falls. All of these places competed to be the major city. The argument basically came down, I think, to where can an ocean-going vessel come? How high up the river can it get and unload and then put it on smaller ships to get to other places? Portland won that argument. I will explain well, for a couple of reasons. One, it seems to be true that it was the place where you got an ocean-going vessel but almost always get to where it is. The other thing is that downtown Portland is one of the few places, and we'll see this in a later drawing, where the river was firm, the water and the ground were firm and not either a cliff or a marsh. And the third thing is they were better promoters, and the Portland advocates built something called the Great Plank Road, which went out to what's now Washington County, which was the first agricultural heartland for Oregon. Obviously, the sort of basic topography of the place makes a big difference. And this is a feature topography map from the 1850s. So it's a little different than the way we think about it now. I think the Tualatin Mountains or the West Hills obviously haven't changed. the beach views on the east side and the river haven't changed, but you don't think of the central east side as being a marsh, but it was. All of northwest Portland was a marsh, all the flat part of northwest Portland was a marsh. And again, this is one of the few places where firm ground came down. So figuring out how to move around in this landscape was really important at the beginning. And so, of course, the first thing they did was follow the Native American trails. Because people had been living here for centuries and had figured out how to move through this landscape with the least amount of physical effort. So here's the first settlement map from 1852, and you can see the major, what were their trails and became the, what have become major roads. So here's Powell Boulevard and Foster Road, and Milwaukee Avenue, and Macadam Avenue, and the Great Plank Road, and the road to Vancouver, and the road to, this is Sandy Boulevard. So all of those roads are in place by 1852, because our predecessors put them in place. Downtown Portland is a grid, and because the river is what's important, that grid is oriented to the water, not to the north-south patterns yet. The other thing you'll notice, actually, there is the route through here that is what we sometimes call Sullivan's Gulch. And the thing, it's the result of an ice age dam breakage in Montana, succeeding dams, and the water couldn't all get down to Columbia, so it makes various other side routes. And this is one of them. And you will, for transportation history, it's important because every time we want to try a new mode of transportation, we throw it in the ditch. So it's just to see how it's going to work, and you'll see that as we go forward. Here's a view looking at Portland as if you were over in a drone over the central east side. Thing to notice about it again is the grid is oriented parallel and perpendicular to the river. The river is what is important. This is where all the early development is happening. The fairly odd thing about Portland is it has very small blocks. They're 200 by 200. They never wrote down why they did it, but they did. So we have streets that are 60 feet wide this way and 80 feet wide this way. And that sort of set the pattern for the first 60 or 70 years of people just coming. The important thing I think to know is the government has virtually no role in this. There is no city government at this point. There is a state territorial government, but this is just property owners making decisions, people who've made land claims, deciding what to do. Here's a view from the 1860s, looking south on Front Avenue. This is a mixed-use development. There's shops below and housing and offices above. The wharves are on the other side, the back side of these buildings. The forest is very nearby. And clearly, if you look at all the stuff, through traffic is not a big issue. They do not care. Another really major influence is the Jeffersonian land survey system, the township and range. And up here in the West Hills, there's a park called Willamette Stone Park, not too far off Burnside. And it is the place where all the surveys for most of Oregon and most of Washington start. And they laid out this mile square grid there. So this is one of those miles, and it's now Stark Street. Here's Broadway. Going the other way, here's Division, Holgate, etc. So the Native Americans put in what becomes the big roads in the 20s and 30s. The land survey system comes in place, and everybody essentially decides, oh, I'm going to follow it as I claim my land. And so we get this pattern of land ownership, which then creates the secondary road system for the city. And you'll notice that There are a few plats that aren't oriented that grid, like in downtown and St. John's, the places that started first, they platted out their property before there was a land survey, which came in the mid-1850s. And so they just did it however they wanted to. After that, it was just easier to do it to follow the grid. And the thing to notice is sometimes grid surveying is not all that accurate. So you get a situation like here's the division, and there's a bump here, and then it's a little higher up. And if you know 41st and division, there's a bump in the road system because it's just too much trouble to come back later and fix it. So thinking about this early landscape, it's important to realize that most of the people who are living in what's now the current Portland city limits are farmers. Right in downtown, the core of what's now downtown is mostly merchants, and they're selling stuff. They're shipping once the gold rush happens, that's how we kind of have our first little boom, is to supply both food and logs to California, gold rush. But if you have a farm like this happens to be where Cleveland High School is today, just for orientation. It's actually probably about 1890s or so photograph. You would have lived on a farm like this. This would be your barn. You do things by horse. You'd have a working wagon, a slightly, you go to town working wagon, and then maybe if you're going, this is your go to church wagon. But the same poor horse is dealing with all of these, and you're not really traveling that often. You might go to downtown Portland once a week, is all, just to sell. The roads don't have to be very good as a result, because you're not traveling. So this is actually in the 1890s. This is the Great Plank Road that made Portland the center of the Pacific Northwest. It's now where the Sunset Freeway is. So think about the scale difference over time. I'm talking to you about the pattern, but the other thing that's happening is everything is through time is going to get a lot bigger. Sunset is six and 7 lanes in each direction. Here it's barely 1 lane wide, and that was enough to get started. So this happens to be downtown Hillsborough instead of downtown Portland, but this is a group of farmers gathering once a week to change and exchange and do business. And really, most of the rest of the week they weren't traveling around. They're on their farm, they're doing their farming work. As the city begins to grow, these farmers, and I sort of left out the way they got their land is they were allowed to claim, an individual could claim up to 160 acres, a couple could claim up to 320 acres, ignoring for a minute what the Native Americans thought of this whole deal, but because they essentially got excluded from the land. They lost their lands, the treaties were not, the conditions were not met and so on, but the subdivisions, the land was subdivided into these 160 and in some cases 320 acre parcels or different sizes. Farmer would claim them. If you built a house and lived on it for 5 years, they were yours for free. You didn't have to pay anybody anything. As the city grows, people decide there needs to be some places, so the same kind of affordable housing we're dealing with today. They're dealing with the same questions. Oh, I think I'll break off a little corner of my farm and subdivide it. And basically, I'll look at subdividing it pretty much like downtown Portland is subdivided. In this case, they made double-length blocks. And because travel is mostly on foot, there's no need to make the streets line up, because you just jog around. They do oriented. By this time, there is a steam railroad in what is now Union Avenue. Excuse me, this is Canny. And this is Woodlawn area. And the train goes on its head in order to get to the ferry that takes you to Vancouver. So just like the river controlled how people subdivided, the railroad did the same thing. Here, there's a railroad station right there. So this subdivider orients his property to the station, because that's what matters to him, which is why we have that Woodlawn Triangle area today that people get lost in. But you can also see that they don't really care whether the streets line up that much. It's not that important to them. They're subdividing property more than they are providing for transportation, which is why we have a lot of places inside the city, in between those mile grids or half-mile grids, where you have a broken street system like this. Into this world comes the steam locomotive and the steam engine. And the first transcontinental railroad in our area is in 1883, and it comes down to Banfield. And that's Sullivan's Gulch. They stick it in Sullivan's Gulch because it's out of the way. It's not disturbing anybody. It gets here. So this is actually an early 20th century picture. That's probably the 12th Avenue overcrossing, maybe the 20th. You can see we've got lots of blackberries already by then. The other form of railroad that we had is a horse car. This is First Avenue in downtown, in what's now the Skidmore district. These buildings still exist. The rest of them have been torn down. You can see the horse, for the horse car sitting there at the end. They have tracks in the middle of the street. It goes for like 15 blocks. It takes probably 15 or 16 minutes to travel that distance. The benefit of it though is that if you compare moving through the mud and moving through on rails, it's like 30 times more efficient. So it only takes one horse instead of lots of horses to move things. So again, by this time there is a city, but all the city is doing is saying, you can have a permit to run a streetcar in our street. They're not doing anything else. They're guaranteeing you that you're the only person that's going to be in this street, but somebody else might be on the street and walk away. A lot of private companies form each one to start out with one line and then they begin to expand into other lines. This is the intersection of Grand and Morrison on the east side of the river. And it's where two different companies had their horse car lines cross. And you can see that some entrepreneurial business person has erected a store with a shelter in front of it for people to wait. And this is how, this is transit-oriented land use, 1883, 1884 version. So it's the beginning of that kind of development. This is the Morrison Bridge when it opened in 1887. It is a privately owned bridge. You pay a toll to cross it, depending on how many sheep or horses you had with you. You paid a different toll or walk, you paid a different amount. Some of the same people who built the bridge and charged the toll also owned the streetcar line. So they charge you right across. And then they're very clever. They bought a piece of property where on the Sunnyside neighborhood, about between Stark and Hawthorne, from around 30th East, this is 30th here, and they subdivided it and they sold you lots. So at the beginning, there's nobody living out here, so they're not really making any money off the streetcar. They're making money off of selling a property. And then the more people buy, it's too far away to walk to work or to shop or whatever downtown. Riding the streetcars and how they make money. And again, there's no TriMet, there's no city setting up rules about this. This is all the private sector making all the decisions about stuff. This is the shop and real estate office at 30th and Belmont that they built for people to wait. See, it's got waiting for the streetcar, but it's also, we'll sell you candy or cigarettes while you're waiting, and we'll sell you a lot if that's what you want. This would have been a more sort of more typical home from the 1880s and 90s. This is maybe a little fancy, but not super fancy. The thing to note is that these people are in their front yard, on the street. It's a very quiet street because There's only people walking by and every once in a while a horse. This is where you would eat with your friends or talk to people or sit outside. The backyard is where you had your chickens and you hung out your laundry and stuff like that. It's a working place. The front yard is your socializing place. That develops a city that has a certain kind of porch orientation that becomes valuable in a different way in the future. And in our city, people think about it, have trouble thinking about how to deal with it. So this is a map of 1889 in the system. The streetcars are the solid lines. So here's Belmont and Hawthorne and King and south into South Portland and up in the northwest and on several lines. The thing to notice, I think, is this kind of bizarre line, the Waverly Woodstock line. This is Woodstock Boulevard between 41st and 44th, where the core of the business district is today. And this is all set out by this early date. And then there's this line that runs in Albina as a loop, and then you can get on another one that takes you all the way up to St. John's as well. And St. John is really a separate city at this point. If this is a map now of where people have platted property, and as you can see, it's pretty much as close as they can get to these streetcar lines. There's a couple of people who try something else, but they don't get to sell property because who's going to get to it? How are they going to get to it? It really focuses development around that streetcar line. As the city continues to grow, it's not just downtown that has a core activity business center. This is the intersection of Russell and Williams in the Albina area, which had a department store, and as you see, a drugstore, and offices, and lawyers and stuff. If you went down the hill, you got to the Union Pacific Railroad Yards, where a lot of people work. So they came up the streets here. People from the downtown and the Central East Side would have been riding the streetcars up this way. The dome that you see there, was all replaced as part of the renewal project in the Albina area for Emmanuel Hospital. It was supposed to be for Emmanuel Hospital. So the only thing that's left is the dome, which is now in the park up the street from there. As part of, you would think of it as a band shell, but it's actually the tower, top of that tower. Here's Belmont Street in the early 20th century. They've just torn down that wooden building I showed you in the earlier view of Sunnyside, where the offices are. If you were to go out there today, most of these buildings on the south side of the street are still there. Some of them, which in this state are 3-story buildings, have been cut down to 1-story buildings. And then recently, I think one of them has been, somebody built a 3-story building where the 1-story building has been. But the thing to notice about the street, the 60-foot right of way, the streetcar clearly is the dominant thing, even in the early auto era, and the sidewalks are also enormous and socializing space as well as.
What intersection is, you said Belmont, and is this the?
This is Belmont at 33rd.
33rd.
So this
Okay,
one,
yeah.
yeah. So the Bay Windows, you recognize it. Now I said that a lot of people did grids. Some people decided, well, let's see what else we can do. As we go forward, we'll get new street patterns. So William Ladd, who's pictured here, he died in 1893, I think, or 2. But just before he died, he platted that edition. When he died, he was worth $5 million, and he was the wealthiest man in the Pacific Northwest, just for scale. There are other people worth quite a bit more today, right? So he platted this. It was supposed to, and it started out as a working class subdivision, supposed to be for workers. Because it was for workers, you couldn't sell alcohol inside because you couldn't want workers drinking. But some of the things he did were, first of all, he's really the first developer subdivisions who said, not only am I gonna plat the land, I'm going to build the streets and sidewalks. I'm going to plant street trees. I am going to begin to make a community. And the other thing that he did, as you'll see this in his pattern, is he has different kinds of streets. So those two big diagonals, Ladd and Elliott, are much wider and they're kind of like through streets. And then he has little local streets. This is where you can tell this show started in 1974 with all the things. And then it has alleys, which is pretty nice. Many of the neighborhoods that have alleys were owned by the Ladd family. At some point in the past, they would like to be put in alleys, and they're very unusual and important. So he really establishes the idea that there can be different types of streets of different widths. And then the last form of rail transportation that comes in is in the early 20th century, we go from having these streetcar lines to called interurbans. And they are basically like streetcars, except instead of stopping every 2 to 3 blocks, they stop every quarter to half mile. And they are used to begin settling the hilly parts of Southwest, what's now East Portland and Gresham Mountain in this direction. And the land pattern is different that goes with that. At this point, there are these outer areas that are imagining that people are wanting both the kind of the country living and the city living. You can live in the suburb but work in the city. So this happens to be the one that was on Multnomah Boulevard. This is the Multnomah Business District. The white building still exists today in the core of the district. These are owned by big national railroad companies in most cases. And this is the Oregon Electric. And the other one that ran down the valley was a part of the Southern Pacific system. They're electrified. There were about 24 trains a day between Portland and Eugene in around 1910, just instead of 3 or 2, whatever we have today. I think it's about 3. So because it's really the only choice. If you want to drive it, it would have, taking the train is still going to take you about 5 or 6 hours to make the trip. Driving it would be a 2-day trip at this point. This is a kind of a typical subdivision of these outer areas. They're much bigger blocks. You can see there's like 12, instead of 200 by 200, they're like 1,200 by 1,000. And they're almost 100 feet wide blocks. So they're a couple acres each. The idea was that people could, mostly the wife, would stay at home and grow crops, have a small orchard. The man could go into town and work in the industrial area or in the downtown area. The best of both of those worlds. The other thing the interurban did is it gave you access to more rural places. And this is actually out near Oregon City. It was a Chautauqua place where you went to both for recreation on the Clackamas River, but also for educational presentation. To me, these people are way overdressed for recreation, but that's what they're doing. And the interurban provided access to fishing trips in Washington County or down the valley. So it is the way you begin to get out into nature without having to have a horse or a horse and buggy. Because once the city begins to develop, most people don't actually own a horse and buggy. Yes?
Are the interurbans, are they profitable on their own, or do the national railroads like plat and own the land alongside it? Like
In most cases, it's not they don't own the land, it's they build these after all the land donations that happened at the very beginning. So they're trying to insert themselves into this, and they're competing with each other. The two systems in Portland are, one's owned by the Hill family and the other one's owned by the Harriman family, and they're competing with each other all over the country. So in 1906, this is the network. It gives you some idea of how extensive it was. By 1906, all the companies become a single company. They're all, and it's owned by a Philadelphia industrialist who specializes in owning streetcars. This is a map then of where the development is, and you can see that the development is very much concentrated about where the streetcar lines are. In 1904, the city fathers, I would say, and it's not so much the government as people, maybe it's the government and the businesses, I guess, together are realizing that Seattle is about to get bigger than Portland. We just don't think that's a very nice idea. So the first thing that happens is in 1890, the city of Portland, the city of East Portland, and the city of Atlanta re-emerge and become a single city. And that gets our population from 40,000 up to 70,000, so we feel better about our competition. But we also feel like we have to do some things to become more of a cosmopolitan urban place. And one of those things in the early 20th century was to have a parks plan, a park system. So they hired the Olmsted brothers out of Boston to do this parks plan. So this is Mount Tabor, this is Selwood, this is what's now Tryon Creek Strip Park, and this is what's now Thuy Boulevard and Leithardson Drive up through Forest Park. This is a picture of what Thuy looked like when it was new. So I think the only thing in this picture that's still there are the streetlights. The road's been paved. We now have rubber tired buses instead of hard iron wheel buses. And we don't have an open view of the whole city from that hillside anymore. This is really about the only thing that got built in the beginning. Tryon Creek State Park in the southwest was finally acquired in the 1960s. But so this is a long range plan. This is, again, this is the city, it says in 1912. Between 1906 and 1912, we have this kind of coming along with the Lewis and Clark Exposition, the World's Fair that was held here. There's a big push for growth, and it's part of the competition with other cities. And they extend a streetcar line on Sandy Boulevard. They extend one out into what's the Eastmoreland area. And it's the same company, but by 1912, we're beginning to have cars, which we'll get to. And so the streetcar company tells Eastmoreland, we're gonna build this line for you, but you're gonna pay for it. And you're gonna subsidize the users, because we wanna make sure. And the same thing happens with some of the subdivisions off Sandy Boulevard. Again, the city's only role really in all this is to say, yes, you can have a permit, and you're the only one who's gonna be in Sandy Boulevard. You won't have, you don't have to worry about competition. This is about the same time, 1912, as it says, 6th Avenue, Boulder Street downtown. Couple things to notice. First of all, if you want to serve anyone in Portland, this is the only place that all of them can get to. And in fact, it's practically the only place that everyone in the state can get to because of the railroads. So it is very, very concentrated and very, very active. And if you were, say, a dressmaker or a hat maker, you wouldn't be down here on the ground floor. You'd be up on the 5th or 6th floor in these buildings. Because these buildings are really, and we think of those older buildings as office buildings. They weren't. They were really multi-use buildings. The other thing to notice is there are absolutely nobody who's crossing at the corners. This is that era when film could catch people walking because the speed limit for cars was 6 miles and horse and buggies was 6 miles an hour. Crossing everywhere was pretty safe. Just in terms of intensity, here's a shop space. It's about the length of a parked car, maybe a little longer. There's a ground floor use, there's a mezzanine use, and the same thing next door. Again, it's really, really intensively used. In 1912, we do what's called a City Beautiful Plan, and again, this is a private group like the City Club that actually gets this idea started, not so much the government. This is as if you were in the hills south of BSU, looking out over their idea of what the city should be like. This is what's now the South Parkplex. This is, I think, basically, this is the Hawthorne Bridge, so this is about Jefferson Street there. So they imagine, where the buildings are taller than 8 stories, we'll leave them, but everywhere else we expect buildings to be 6 to 8 stories. So Paris is very clearly their image. And their streets are the same way, you know, we have the park blocks, but they've also created another park block east-west. They widened Burnside Street from end to end, they put in some diagonal streets. Paris is their model. And so their idea of the street is that everything is going to happen in that same street space. Pedestrians, transit, cars, the whole works. This kind of gets disrupted. This whole idea of we're going to build very dense cities. It's disrupted by the introduction of the automobile. The first way that it shows up in transportation, this happens to be a dentist in Forest Grove, and he has bought a car. This is the back of it, this is a postcard. And he has bought a car, and he advertises that when he drives into Portland, he will pick you up for the interurban fare and take you into Portland, and he travels just before the interurban fare. For this lasts for about 2 years, and then the city outlaws what are called jitneys. People still do it, of course.
And now called Uber,
Excuse me.
which is now called Uber and Lyft.
Wait, well, Uber is the same idea. We also then we have cars. We have to begin to accommodate our Victorian houses to cars. So here's a Victorian house on Southeast 7. It didn't originally have a garage. There's no reason it would have a garage. They put in a garage in order to make it meet modern life. Again, here's another view of downtown Hillsborough from a postcard. This is the Great Plank Road as it came into Hillsborough, and they're lifting up the planks for the last time, because at 6 miles an hour, driving over those planks is okay. At 15 or 20 miles an hour, driving those planks is not a good, comfortable thing to do. So we're going to pave streets. So suddenly there's a new cost, and this is where government roles really begin to come into play. We also have to have traffic control. So this is an officer. Before we have stoplights, he's standing in the middle of the street. He has a pole, and it says go on 2 flaps and stop on the other 2. And he turns it 90 degrees to allow some people to go and other people not to go. Again, this only works when your speed limits are 6 and 10 miles, so miles an hour. This is the first traffic count map. So you can see that the bridges are where these people are going. And what's really happening is people who used to take the streetcar are now driving, and they're just driving on the same streets. And of course, once you start counting cars, then you start thinking about how many more there's going to be in the future. So this is Southeast 7th. They decided we're going to turn it into a more major street. So this is before the widening, and this is what it looks like after the widening. And for the next 40 years, that's kind of what the city is doing. It's either buying right away, as it did in this case, to widen the street, or narrowing the sidewalks to provide for more traffic all over town. The extreme case of that is Burnside, as it says in the 1930s. They replaced the Burnside Bridge. Burnside, because it's an east-west street, was only 60 feet wide. They widened it. They widened it by this building on the north. They left the front wall. They demolished the next 20 feet. They put the front wall on rollers, and they rolled it back and reattached it to the building. So if you go out there today, you will see that this building is still there, but it's very shallow, and you'll wonder why. And that's true all, as you can see, it's happening all along the street on the south side. Most of them ended up getting demolished. On the east side of the river on Burnside, there are those columns and the sidewalks are underneath. That's not original. That was their way of widening the street on the east side. What?
What cross street is that, where we could see that building? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I don't.
What building is that, like, what?
Oh, this is, it's a performance hall, it's a music performance place now. US Bank Tower is right here. The Hoxton Hotel is right there. This used to be easy when I first came here. There was a big sign on top that said Jesus, the light of the world, and it was a church. And I don't remember now what the name of the hall is. Okay, so this is a view after Burnside has been widened, so in the late 30s, it's an aerial view of downtown. And you can see that virtually every block is full of something. It's a very, again, even in this early auto era, it's a very dense, actively used place. But the idea of what we're going to do elsewhere is beginning to change. Instead of the Victorian house with the front, we're now going to, so this is a house on what's now the Portland Gresham boundary. That's a real estate piece. And the backyard is where you socialize. And the front yard is just for decorative stuff. After World War II, they began to worry about this dense city, which is parts of it are getting pretty old and falling in shape, and it's happening all over the country. We have this whole set of programs for urban renewal, which become, well, two things are happening. We're having urban renewal to replace things. So actually where we are right now was an urban renewal project that was designed to allow Portland State to go from a one building campus to a large university. Emmanuel was a place that was supposed to, in Albina, was supposed to be a place that would take it from a small hospital to a much larger hospital, and that didn't happen. The decision had been made that we wanted a memorial college, what we now call a Memorial Coliseum, and the decision was made to take this area. This is where the Memorial Coliseum is now. This is where I-5 is. This is where Lloyd Center is. Lloyd Center is not an urban renewal area. You can see that it's actually mostly vacant where the shopping center is. Somebody had started buying, the Lloyd family had started buying up properties in the 1920s to be developed. But in the lower Albina area, the Villains Edition, as it's called, this is the Memorial Coliseum. So they buy out everything, they tear out everything. Mostly African American neighborhood, and build the Coliseum. Here's Lloyd Center, the freeway. We're now building freeways. What do? We stuff it in Sullivan's Gulch because it's out of the way. It doesn't bother anybody. But in terms of land use, it's a dramatic change, both in terms of the center and the amount of parking that is needed for this. So the whole idea of what the city begins to change. In some places, this is I-5 North, what used to be called the Minnesota Freeway, and it was called that because Minnesota Street was completely eliminated. And they knew what the Sullivan's Gulch Freeway was like, so they essentially tried to create one from scratch. They bought out everything. They dug a hole, they built over crossings, and put the freeway in the hole. But it had the effect of separating many of the people who shopped on Mississippi Avenue, which was a streetcar line. And so the Mississippi Avenue Business District died. It's now come back, but it took 40, 50 years for it to change, and it changed dramatically in that time period. If you come downtown, the emphasis, this again is a postcard, we're emphasizing the car city. This is Morrison Street where the Max runs today. And this is Pioneer Square on this side, just to think about things. So all of this upset creates a desire to do something different. And the city starts in the 1970s, 1960s, early 70s, to think about downtown and how you might have downtown grow without having to build more facilities. And that's where the idea of the transit mall first comes from. This is that. So the idea is to actually go back in some ways to transit-oriented development, to have a place, a spine of streets where the transit is, and that's the spine of where highest density development, either retail or office goes. There had been a freeway built on the waterfront, just in Harbor Drive. And the decision was made that we could get rid of that when I-405 was built and replaced with Waterfront Park. So there's a whole different set of values that begins to come into play, many of them much more like the earlier values that had occurred when the city was first developed. And this is a time period when the idea of the max line, first it's just a single line, comes in, and the idea that the kind of development you're going to have is not like the old streetcar lines, like consistent on every other block with a stop, but that the stops would be a quarter mile to a half mile apart, and development would be spaced out across the region, and you're thinking about it from the whole region. And when that line was built, then it was put on Morrison and Yamhill. And if you look at the way the 60 feet of space is distributed, it's very much like the old Belmont Street, not like Morrison Street in the 1950s photograph. It's beginning of thinking about the city in a different way. And I think this is the last one then. This is beginning to apply some of those old principles to thinking about the whole city in terms of centers and corridors, and recognizing that the way Southwest developed and the way the streetcar neighborhoods developed and the way that the interurban neighborhoods developed are different, and that the way you need to respond to that with land use planning and public investment and so on is maybe different in each case. So I think, yeah, thank you very much.
To recognize, PBOT was not even called PBOT, it was called the City of Portland.
PBOT.
PBOT, it was PBOT.
Department.
I want to thank you, Steve, for coming here tonight, to share all of this. And almost every topic that you brought up, the Albina, the streetcar, the light rail, bringing back streetcar, all of those will get integrated back into our classroom. And we'll have folks from the Albina vision, Rick Adams coming at the end of class, yes, to talk about rebuilding Albina. We do have a resident, Richard here, who once upon a time came from Albina.
Yeah, from the three.
You are free. You are free.
The freeway. It's all of them.
Yeah, I just want us to recognize that and all, like, the predecessors before the Americans came in, the Native Americans really built those lines. I love going through the city and seeing what used to be in the history of the city. So I just want to give an applause to Steve because he's Okay, so shall we break before the next presentation? I think it would be good to kind of clear our minds a bit. Yes, I see a question. Yes.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll get the slides.
Yes. Yes, they are actually in the Google Drive right now, both under the shared drive under week 3. So we've got all the speakers' presentations on there. Yes, Richard?
We're going to be testing on this presentation.
Oh, yeah, just math quick. Math. That's why I'm telling you to bring food, so that you can your brain. I see a question here, Aaron.
No.
Stretch, yeah, let's get up and stretch. Guys, let's get up and stretch for 5 minutes, and then we'll resume with Shawn.
Yeah.
Is there any way to view the speaker notes on either of these?
Yes. We have Shawn and here, who's gonna talk
This
about
just reflects
our
the screen,
transportation
so this
history, but also the history of racism
that.
in our transportation system. So, Shawn is formerly a MERP student here, more MERP graduate for those MERPs here. And this is one of his first public presentations on this topic. So I'm happy to have Shawn here to share perspective very similar to what Steve shared, but really behind the scenes, what PBOT is doing to fight racism.
Some technical difficulties real quick, trying to get up to the speaker net, so I'm not looking down constantly.
Yeah, it's not showing up.
Perhaps if you hit escape on that.
You wanna do this way? Is there?
Presenter view is on. That's all. I do have notes. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, this is my first time presenting on this. I've done research on this for about 4 years now. I am a planner, as was said, at PBOT. I work on area project planning, have some history working in communication as well. And yeah, I just got to offer a disclaimer. This topic is, of course, really robust. As Steve's presentation is pretty clear, it's really hard to make this comprehensive in a pretty short period of time. So I just want to say that this is an overview. There are certainly gaps in this presentation. So just I like to offer that disclaimer before I start. Before we begin, I've got a question just for you to consider to yourselves while we go through this is, what is the purpose of transportation? And just generally, what is the purpose of transportation infrastructure itself? And then who is it for? Human geographers say that the unique purpose of transportation broadly is to overcome space. It's impacted by distance, scale, governance and control of movement, and of course, topography. Here are a few key functions. We've got mobility or movement, which takes many forms, of course, many modes. Pedestrians, people rolling, bicycling, using transit and driving is, of course, key. It implies the freedom to move safely and easily through space. And of course, access. Without places to go, mobility itself becomes somewhat limited. And then public space, one that's not talked about as much. 40% of the land area in Portland is actually made up of streets. That's a lot of space, and it's all public. As far as public space goes, it's not just for movement. People use it to gather, they use it for commerce, they use it to loiter. They, stopping and selling the flowers, something we should be able to do. And then, of course, it serves a key function in democracy, being where we address grievances and protesting. Given those functions, I've got a couple more questions for you. Just to consider, of course, question is, how is transportation provided and governed? And then who is benefited and who is burdened by those decisions? And finally, who is at the table when those decisions are being made? Okay, I'm not going to go into too many foundational concepts. Most of these are not text heavy like this, but I think some of this is important. The history that we're exploring does exist in a broader national and societal context. Much of what happened in Portland happened across the country, and actions, decisions, and policies at every level of government impacted this history. As such, it's important to note, of course, the pervasiveness of white supremacy and racism in American culture, especially historically. Dominant ideas of white superiority, including the divine right to spread civilization and enlightenment across the continent, were based on social constructs with no basis in fact. But they were taught broadly, including in schools, like the illustration here from a children's geography textbook from 1850. Of course, the history is related to broader movement and people of goods through time and space as well, including the governance and control of movement, as I said, that impacts individuals, communities, and in some cases, entire populations. And of course, this history is impacted by social movements and cultural and social change through time, which we will discuss a bit. And then most importantly, the writing of history itself, both due to popular ideas at the time and the people doing the writing, skews or omits a lot of the story. One other foundational concept is the connection between urban systems, and particularly between transportation and urban form, which Steve talked about. Systems overlap, as do the organizations that govern those systems. For our discussion, how land is used, how and what kind of development how and what kind of development occurs is impacted by transportation and land use, vice versa. Individually and combined transportation and land use impact access to developable space and thus activity and development patterns, and the shifting of people and capital or investments and disinvestments through space and time. I also think it's important to disclaim that what we're discussing today was shaped by human actions and decisions. None of it was inevitable. The settlement of Oregon itself is a transportation story. American westward expansion and settlement was predicated on that white supremacist notion called manifest destiny. The idea that white Americans were divinely ordained to spread the US empire across the US continent. This idea was popularly depicted in art, such as this painting by John Gast from 1870. Note the white personification of the United States, that's known as Columbia, carrying a school book and spreading light across the land from east to west. Of course, this idea led to the forced displacement, genocide, and attempted forced assimilation of indigenous Americans across the country, including, of course, at Oregon. Federally issued Indian Removal Acts, paired with various decisions like the Oregon Donation Land Use Law, entitled male settlers to hundreds of acres of stolen land. Only 1 in 10 indigenous Americans survived these atrocities, and predominantly white settlers irreversibly reshaped native ancestral spaces in Portland. When white settlers arrived in Oregon Territory, they also viewed it or envisioned it as a white utopia. The territorial government banned slavery, but it also forbade Black people from living here. When Oregon became a state in 1857, its constitution banned Black people from visiting, residing in, owning property, using the judicial system, or entering any contract in the state, with punitive measures to make sure that that was the case. This, of course, curtailed, but did not stop all Black settlements, and this racist language did remain in our state constitution until 2002. Transportation development during Portland's early years relied on the exploitation and exclusion of people of color. Chinese settlers were among the first non-indigenous people to settle in the region as part of the gold rush in the 1850s. Many Chinese residents became farmers and laborers and helped build significant infrastructure throughout the region. As the Chinese population grew, Portland's Chinatown formed around Southwest 2nd Avenue and Oak Street, shown here. As the areas and the nation's Chinese population grew, legal exclusion and discrimination became more severe. In 1873, City Council passed a resolution encouraging contractors building streets and other infrastructure to exclude Chinese workers. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, curtailing immigration and barring access to citizenship. It would not be repealed until 1943. Nonetheless, the Chinese community became an integral part of Portland's social fabric. By 1900, Portland had the second largest Chinese community on the west coast of the United States. Those early streetcars that Steve talked about connected people to those subdivided lots in Portland's first suburbs for development, which make up most of what are now inner neighborhoods. Due to discrimination, that access benefited almost exclusively white developers and white home purchasers. It is critical to note that home ownership, a critical tool for wealth generation in the United States, was not equally accessible for the first 2/3 of the 20th century and still has measurable racial discrimination and inequities today. Many housing developments, including Laurelhurst, had racial covenants in the house deeds, banning people of color from living in those houses unless they were servants. In 1919, Portland Realty Board decided to stop selling homes to people of color in white neighborhoods, claiming that their presence would lower property values. And then from 1933 to 1977, a federal government-sponsored corporation created graded maps claimed to measure lending risk. Areas with higher concentrations of communities of color, and particularly Black communities, were given the lowest grade, or redlined, effectively segregating and isolating those communities of color to areas that for decades would suffer disinvestment. A little bit about zoning. Zoning is a set of laws, of course, and rules that govern what someone can build on a piece of land, and by proxy, who can live there by nature of affordability. Zoning requiring low density development, such as single dwelling zoning or single family homes as they're known, limits the construction of more affordable housing types. Portland adopted its first zoning code in 1924. Single dwelling zoning covered white wealthy neighborhoods, including Laurelhurst, Alameda, and the West Hills. These areas continue to be disproportionately white and higher income today. Such zoning was expanded to cover more than 90% of Portland's land area in 1959 and included off-street parking requirements, again driving up the cost of housing in these areas. Steve already discussed Bennett's plan for Portland during the City Beautiful era, but it's important to note that planning as a profession during these years was highly technocratic, very centralized, relied on no community engagement whatsoever. Bennett's Greater Portland Plan lauded the order and beauty of European cities, and his work was broadly predicated on the assimilation of immigrants through the built environment, with his contemporaries viewing racially integrated neighborhoods as a menace to the moral and physical health of the community. Bennett considered cars to be the lifeblood of the city, and his plan for Portland set the stage of automobile prioritization. Also, while the plan was voted upon by residents, the only plan to do so in Portland's history, only men, and disproportionately and predominantly white men, due to exclusionary laws, were able to do so. For most of the past century, transportation planning in Portland and investments by proxy in Portland and across the United States have prioritized the automobile, often benefiting higher income white residents at the expense of working class people and people of color. By 1920, car popularity had exploded in Portland. The next year, Portland's Planning Commission created the major traffic street plan for Portland, classifying streets for traffic movement. Arterials, as Steve showed you, would be widened, leading to residential and business displacement. Often working class people were displaced. Local or minor streets in those single dwelling areas would preserve quiet, restful, home-like neighborhoods for predominantly higher income and white people. Those safe and pleasant streets while communities of color were often relegated to apartments along those high volume streets, exposing them to the health and burdens of an auto-centric environment. It was so severe that by 1926, Portland had more cars per capita than New York or Chicago. In the 1940s, planner Robert Moses, regarded broadly today as overtly racist in his work to build mega projects through communities of color to remove slums and reinforce segregation, there's a quote by him in the 1970s, created a plan for post-World War II Portland, utilizing what has been characterized as an undemocratic governmental form. Moses created that plan again with no community engagement, validating a public work agenda to build grade separated freeways across the city. Viewing cars as the future of cities, his plan recommended zoning changes to ensure low density development with the allocation of significant space to parking, a practice now associated again with cost prohibitive to affordable housing provision. The plan would help validate the groundwork for the freeway era that would begin the next decade. During World War II, Portland's Black population grew tenfold, from 2,000 to more than 20,000. Many immigrated here from the South to build ships for the war effort. Already high racial tension intensified, and communities of color faced discrimination in all aspects of life. Real estate racism and the ensuing housing shortage from the rapidly growing population meant that new Black community members had few options for settlement. In Albina, one of the only areas they were welcome due to that redlining, white residents organized to keep them out of the community. Fearing the myths of increased crime and depreciated property values associated with Black neighbors, they suggested that all new Black residents be forced to settle at the city's edges. Many white residents hoped that they would all leave after the war's end. One such resulting public wartime housing development called Vanport was constructed in a floodplain between the Columbia River and the Columbia Slough. At its peak, Vanport was the second largest city in Oregon, housing around 40,000 people. On Memorial Day in 1948, Vanport was destroyed in less than 30 minutes in a flood. While Vanport's population had declined since the war's end in 1945, in some cases due to the out-migration of those Black residents facing discrimination, 16,000 residents, of whom more than 6,000 were Black, were displaced. The flood killed a recorded 15 people, though many historians and survivors claim that that death toll was much higher. And for those Black residents, or those Black survivors who stayed in Portland, Albina was the only place they could go. By 1950, the area contained over half of the city's Black population. Of course, I'd be remiss to talk about World War II and to leave out the horrifying forced imprisonment of Japanese Americans during the war. Portland's Japanese population had grown steadily since the late 1800s, with many owning farms and operating businesses in the eastern part of the city and county. When internment occurred in the region, more than 4,000 Japanese community members were forced to live in a quickly converted camp and livestock buildings at what is now the Portland Expo Center, while they awaited relocation to more permanent imprisonments. During internment, most of these people lost their land, homes, businesses, and belongings, opening that stolen farmland for more suburban development. In the 1950s, the era of urban renewal began. Combined with post-war housing and transportation policies that supported that suburban outgrowth, inner neighborhoods began losing higher income residents as they fled to housing at the city's edges. The government began declaring these inner areas blighted, characterizing it very racially, as you can see here. And the federal government began giving cities funds to raise entire neighborhoods and replace them with new development and infrastructure projects. These communities were generally those that had, due to racist policies, experienced disinvestment. They nonetheless had often blossomed into thriving cultural and business districts, including historic Black Albina. That hill block building that Steve showed you was the center of what is considered by many to be the center of the Black neighborhood in Portland and Albina, which was destroyed. Of course, over the course of the next 2 decades, successive waves of urban renewal destroyed more than 1,000 homes, several businesses, and displaced innumerable residents. While Albina is only one such neighborhood in Portland, it lost more than 5,000 residents in the 1960s and 1970s, in part due to these redevelopment efforts. Some of Portland's investments delivered during urban renewal and redevelopment were directly related to transportation, while others used transportation problems as a justification for that redevelopment. The aerial photos here are of Lower Albina before and after the construction of mega projects, including the Memorial Coliseum and Interstate 5. Much of this land was repurposed from community-oriented uses to transportation movement and automobile storage, including huge surface parking lots and city transportation vehicle fleet storage where Black and working class homes have been. The freeway era began in earnest with the passage of the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. Highway engineers and planners in Portland and across the country split apart communities of color to construct urban portions of the interstate highway system. Whether this was explicitly or implicitly racist, they were clearly built at the expense and continued burden of communities of color, and particularly Black residents. Virtually every major political player in Portland supported these freeways during the 1950s. 2 such freeways, the East Bank and the Minnesota freeways, which make up I-5 now in inner East and North Portland, were sited through Albina, leaving a great separated gash through the community. Hundreds of families were forcibly displaced, and the state paid them as little as $50 for their houses. That's about $500 today, while offering no financial assistance and little logistical assistance for relocation. And the remaining residents, of course, were left to the burdens of the air and noise pollution and safety issues of that environment. A lot of things were happening during this time. A lot of things were brewing and changing culturally and socially. In 1962, the environmentalist movement really took off. The same year, Jane Jacobs published her seminal work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which critiqued centralized urban planning and freeway construction, paving the way for a shift in the field toward a more community-centric approach in decision-making. Of course, the civil rights era was in full swing, with people of color across the country fighting for equal rights. And in 1969, Oregon began establishing a statewide planning system with rules to guide city and county planning to fight sprawl and to center engagement with affected communities in decision-making. These changes would lead to the passage of several new policies regarding equal rights, the consideration of environmental and social impacts and transportation provision, the requirement of effective relocation assistance to people displaced by public projects, coordinated and comprehensive transportation planning efforts in regions, and federal funding of transit and multimodal improvements in cities. So unlocking the ability for us to actually build things with federal dollars that were not highways. I hate to gloss over the civil rights movement. In Portland, the fight for equal rights in employment, housing, policing, and other aspects of daily life took decades, and many aspects of this long-fought battle are still occurring to this day, as our experiences in 2020 and 2021 made clear. While we don't have the time to discuss it fully, it is important to highlight that myriads of Black people, Indigenous people, and other communities of color have participated in efforts towards racial justice in Portland throughout history. Had all of this not happened, had all of this advocacy and these civil rights movements not occurred, Portland would likely look a lot different today. In 1969, the Columbia Region Association of Governments, or CRAG, what is now Metro, produced a transportation plan for the region. Looking forward to 1990, the approved plan recommended 54 major highway, road, and bridge building projects, many of which would have chopped up Portland into a roughly 2-mile grid of freeways and expressways. Freeway revolts, which some of you might know about, they're pretty famous in Portland. They've been written about extensively. Perhaps the most famous of these was against the Mount Cliff Freeway in Southeast Portland, which would have run through Southeast Portland, roughly between Southeast Division and Clinton Streets. There's an illustration, of course, of what that would have looked like. What is important to note here is that the stories of these victories, while having been written about extensively, often leave out the inspiring efforts of communities of color against such projects in their neighborhoods, which they did. Hundreds of people tried to stop these things from happening. They're written about very little and represented, of course, in news at the time as being ineffective. One academic of this writes, quote, that their efforts remain out of the narrative scope of the freeway revolt, largely because they won few victories, leaving Black neighborhoods like Albina vulnerable to the worst consequences of the interstate highway program. While studies regarding improved bus service had occurred in decades prior, it wasn't until the 1972 downtown plan that transit planning and multimodal transportation planning broadly became a feature of transportation planning in Portland. The impending bankruptcy of the private transit operators resulting from increased automobile use during suburbanization led to the creation of TriMet and public transit operation in the region. The downtown plan included some of the city's most lauded innovations, including Pioneer Square and the Transit Mall. While it did shift focus to non-auto forms of movement, a main goal of the plan was to counter that white flight and to boost revenue to fund public services. So trying to capture choice riders to get them out of cars, which is important, but kind of perhaps relegating communities of color or those who are captive or transit dependent out of the story a little bit more. In 1977, City Council adopted the 1977 Arterial Streets Classification Policy. The policy did list twin priorities of meeting suburban travel demand while minimizing automobile impacts on inner neighborhoods. This policy, along with other planning that decade, represented a major shift that was occurring toward the preservation and revitalization of inner neighborhoods. The policy acknowledged, however, that apartment dwellers who were and are still more likely to be lower income and people of color were forced to suffer the negative impacts of auto traffic while buffering single dwelling neighborhoods because they could only be built along those high volume roadways. Those residents, of course, contributed less to those impacts because they tended to and still tend to own fewer cars. However, it did not address those impacts, portending the perpetuated inequities when the city grew in geography and population in the coming decades. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Albina residents struggled severely with the impacts of decades of disinvestment and destructive urban renewal and development. Continued racism in employment, housing, and lending left many Black residents without the capital to purchase or maintain homes. Disrepair and abandonment became major problems in the neighborhood. By the 1990s, advocacy efforts from those residents renewed city interest in improving conditions for albina. Without effective anti-displacement measures, however, community planning like the Albina Community Plan in 1993 and investments paired with low housing prices created a perfect storm for gentrification and displacement in the neighborhood, especially as Portland's population began to boom in the 1990s and 2000s. In the 1990s, plans for a light rail extension to serve the underserved residents of North Portland began to be funded by an urban renewal area. Community concerns about the potential of the investment to exacerbate already visible gentrification and displacement in Albina led to a key principle of the plan to improve the quality of life for existing residents. While the construction of the yellow line did avoid any direct physical displacement, which is commendable, a complex set of occurrences did lead the transportation investments to be ultimately prioritized over planned anti-displacement measures. An important component of indirect displacement is the shifting, again, of investment and disinvestment from one place to another over time. This infographic from the city's Anti-Displacement Action Plan Foundation report illustrates these dynamics. As the population boom began in Portland in the 1990s, new residents flocked to affordable real estate in places like Albina. As intended investments made into construction, those investments that were intended to serve existing residents, land values increased, which priced out lower income and people who are often from communities of color. Those residents, who of course were intended to be the beneficiaries of public investments, were and are displaced from these areas to areas with even fewer opportunities and worse infrastructure, like East Portland, while newer residents opt to drive instead of using amenities like the yellow line. So that irony that when incomes go up, people actually ride transit less. Skip one, sorry. How bad was it? This map from Portland shows the changes in populations of color from 2000 to 2017 in Portland. While the yellow line is only one piece of the story, the interstate area corridor where the urban renewal area was, or rather is, sorry, it has timed out, but it still exists, lost more than 4,000 households of more than 10,000 Black residents. Okay, what are the impacts of displacement? Of course, there are many. Often people are displaced to more affordable areas, which by nature of their affordability have less nearby amenities and opportunities, as well as lower quality transportation infrastructure and more other-centric environments. The map on this slide highlights two such examples. The one on the left is the Vision Zero Plan map from Portland, the most recent one, showing that 28 of the 30 high crash intersections in Portland are located on or east of 82nd Avenue, very much overlapping those higher concentrations of what communities of color live today. The map on the right shows, this is from PDX, the citywide pedestrian plan from 2019, where sidewalk gaps exist in the city. So that correlation is still really high due to that historic development and then the challenge that exists in the realm of making those investments over time as displacement occurs. Displacement, of course, can also result in increased stress, reduced access to healthcare, increased exposure to pollution, and lower life expectancy. Additionally, people and communities split apart by displacement often have less political power and reduced social cohesion, making them less resilient to disasters or economic recessions. Pedestrian experiences also vary by race. On top of that inequitable access to adequate sidewalks, discrimination and profiling occur. In one such study in Portland, Black participants in Portland waited more than twice as long as white participants to cross the street at crosswalks. Fear of racial bias crimes, which occur and have occurred for decades, violence, microaggressions, and profiling by police also experience the impacts of people of color while walking or rolling. And of course, none of these concerns are unfounded. Portland has been planning for bicycling since the 1970s. While it is, of course, an affordable, climate-friendly mode, bicycling too has its own sordid history. People of color have faced social exclusion from and several barriers to bicycling for more than a century across the country. Bicycle infrastructure has often been characterized by some politicians, especially as a property amenity, and it has come to be associated, understandably, by communities of color with the occurrence of gentrification and displacement. Why? In one such instance on North Williams in Albina in the 2000s, because those amenities came well after gentrification began to occur, longtime Black community members felt the improvements were intended to serve those newer, higher income, and often white residents, instead of the city making those investments when more Black people lived there. As people bicycling, of course, communities of color face a lot of those same fears and concerns around safety and security on streets as well. And streets, as I mentioned, are a key function of democracy. They're protest spaces for organizing and for social movements, including civil rights and racial justice. These uses are constitutionally protected. Use of streets for these purposes without fear of harm has varied throughout history based on race. From the 1960s to very recently, as many of us experienced or partook in 2020 and 2021, Portland streets have been hostile environments for demonstrations for racial justice. BIPOC Portlanders are overrepresented heavily as victims of police brutality, especially in this context. So a little bit lighter equity in planning. In the 1990s, federal and state legislation and planning practices shaped community engagement efforts to focus on really reaching underserved and marginalized community members. Planning requirements had clear goals of reducing automobile usage and addressing inequities in the transportation system. In 2005, the city launched Vision PDX, a community-led initiative for Portland's needs 20 years in the future. This plan was the first long-range planning document in Portland to list equity as a top value. Vision PDX would inform the development of every plan to follow, and the integration of equity became a key component of all local planning efforts afterwards. As part of the Portland plan, the city created a clear mandate to pursue equity goals and racial equity in particular. One initiative led to the 2011 creation of the city's Office of Equity and Human Rights, leading to the development of clear civil rights planning and citywide racial equity goals, as well as the development of racial equity plans for each city bureau, including PBOT. In transportation planning, PBOT has been explicitly integrating equity into planning efforts for more than a decade. One such example is the 2018 Transportation System Plan, a state-mandated long-range plan to guide transportation investments for 20 years in the future. This TSP, the 2018 update, integrated new goals and policies, including those focused on equity. And equity was, of course, used as a key evaluation and project prioritization as well. There was also a shift to prioritize the most vulnerable road users first in order to move people more efficiently, and of course, to improve outcomes for people who are dependent on non-auto modes of travel. Equity prioritization. In 2017, PBOT developed a tool called the Equity Matrix, ranking census tracts in the city based on race, ethnicity, and income to help staff prioritize investments with areas of higher concentrations of people of color and lower income communities. Equity analysis and equitable focus engagement as a part of planning and project development have become standard. In 2019, PBOT launched Moving to Our Future, a strategic plan to guide PBOT's work through 2024. This plan directs staff to ask two fundamental questions of all of our work. Will it advance equity and address structural racism? And of course, interrelated to that, because of climate change's impacts on people of color, will it reduce carbon emissions? Shifts toward mobility justice or transportation justice, so beyond equity, but beyond just the distributions of benefits and burdens, which consider the transformative changes in relationships with underserved communities, that achievement of equity, and the redistribution of power, resources, and opportunities to those who experience the greatest disparities in order to, in turn, improve outcomes for everyone. PBOT has been developing a transportation justice framework to guide all of our work since 2019. While this work is ongoing, planners at PBOT and throughout the country are working with community members and community-based organizations and advocacy groups to grapple with key questions toward mobility justice. Some of those include how we decolonize data, how we redefine personal safety, how we make more equitable decisions with community knowledge and expertise more than statistical data, and how do we foster and maintain relational and transparent non-extractive relationships with community members. And of course, very importantly, how do we stabilize those groups against indirect displacement as we make investments in those areas? I just want to make clear that as planners, we do very much view that there is a future possible where we can do better and justice can be achieved for everyone. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Shawn. I want to use this opportunity as a way to bring up Steve as well. If it's possible, we can do a panel questions, Q&A. Is that? Because we didn't get a chance to do that up to your presentation, but I think this is a great opportunity to bring you both up. There are chairs here if you want to sit down. Shawn and Steve.
Yeah. Just sit down.
Yeah, I think, you're seeing two very different perspectives of history and transportation planning. One is a very racist perspective, and the other is also like, what happened, where did it go, who did this, how did this get developed over time? But being able to see two of these perspectives intertwined together in one night is pretty powerful, I have to say. Thank you very much. We do a round of applause again to first off. So I'm gonna let you lead the questions, really, the questions have come about regarding the presentation for Shawn or Steve.
This is just a very minor point of clarification for myself. Steve, you mentioned 200 by 200 foot blocks. We also mentioned that downtown and these blocks were 60 feet by 80 feet. How does the 60 feet by 80 relate to the 200 by 200?
The 60 foot is the width of the east-west streets, and 80 feet is the width of the south-north streets. If you wander around downtown, south of Burnside, there are different widths. And you can do different things with them. So if you've ever like ridden on the transit mall, you notice when you get north of Burnside, all of a sudden, there's only 2 lanes instead of 3. You know, you can just, it gives you some spatial flexibility. And the buildings feel different because when you're in a wider street, you feel different about them. That didn't really transfer into our neighborhoods.
How democratic would you say the development of the transportation systems in Portland have been throughout history? And if they have become more democratic over time, when would you say that had happened? I guess I can start with my perspective. I would say that they arguably started undemocratically exclusively to start. Of course, much of the transportation infrastructure that developed was done privately initially. We have shifted toward a more democratic approach debatably, but there are a lot of perspectives as to how democratic that process actually is and how effective it actually is today.
It's a fair, and I'm not sure we're there. To tell you the truth. And I'm also not sure that democratic is even the right word. Somehow, some of the, democratic could be very, you can end up with a democratic result that is the majority favors it, and it might not be fair and equitable. I think you have to, there's a balancing there that's tough to do, and that's, in some ways, staff and elected officials have to take some leadership role, just as they took a leadership role to say, it's like, we're kind of done with freeways now. We build a couple and we don't like the results, so let's not do that anymore. The same thing has to happen with the whole balance of democratic and equitable. How does that work out?
In the realm of community engagement, we utilize somewhat, well, not traditional. There's systems now in Portland, like neighborhood association program, where we try to reach groups. Those are disproportionately white and homeowner represented. Equity engagement, we try to specifically reach through community groups and individuals, those underserved and underrepresented groups. And then we more heavily weigh their perspectives because they have been out of the story and experienced so many activities for the day. And we do that based on a notion of what we call targeted universalism. When you improve outcomes for those experiencing the worst disparities, the system gets improved anyway, so it does improve outcomes for everyone, no matter what. So it's still technically legal federally, but it allows us to really focus that work in the spaces that need it most.
And I think it's fair to say, for example, the Metro prioritizes in a different way than it did 20 years ago. It uses some of that same equity focus in its decisions about where to invest, where when I worked with them, that was a minor issue, and I don't think it is a minor issue anymore.
Good.
I was wondering, how much of the equity language and equity within PBOT is aspirational versus it's written into the codes and the rules and, the statutes and ordinances that PBOT has to go by?
That's a great question. Because our equity priorities and our goals are in plans that have been adopted by city council, they are guiding policy. So we are required to implement policy in all of our work. But that doesn't imply, in the realm of long range planning, people want it to be pragmatic, but it is always to some degree visionary. Like we always try to achieve as much as possible, even if not everything in that plan is truly achievable within the time period that plan plans. So it serves kind of as a guiding star for the work that we do. But I can say from my experience at PBOT that every single planner prioritizes equity and the application of equity lens in every project.
Because I live in Upper East, and like the displacement map that you put up, it has the three of the neighborhoods where much of the population from Almania moved out to Park Rose, Argate, Village. And yet none of those neighborhoods have a neighborhood greenway. Yet it's supposed to be, we're a PBOT matrix, equity matrix. It's taken me over 2 years and I've yet to get a street light in a school zone, 3 places. So this is why I question the aspiration versus the actual reality.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. We certainly have data to show how much investments we have made in East Portland versus other areas, but the area, as you know, as a resident, is so deficient in that infrastructure. And we as an organization are trying to do a lot with very little. And I know that that sounds like a very, very sad excuse, but it is true. And it's slow and it's inefficient and it probably feels really, really ineffective. But I promise that everyone there, just I'm one person, but I'd be happy to talk to you more about it too. I'm happy to let you know in our chat.
From the last presentation, one thing that really stood out to me was we talking about the yellow line and that kind of being to benefit the existing community there, and maybe taking the wrong path when it's executed, or not in its execution, but in in operation, right? And then also on Williams, right? Some of that more bike-friendly development kind of being a little late, or seeming a little late to the residents who were displaced from the area, kind of following that the income boom there. So I guess what steps, if any, is PBOT taking so that that kind of development that's intended for communities actually reaches those communities in a time that's valuable to them and not just helps push them out?
That is a great question. The yellow line is a specifically, well, all systems are convoluted, they're really complex. Our government no longer exists, it becomes more bureaucratic. We are operating within legal frameworks that we can't change ourselves. And I don't say that as an excuse. But like the yellow line did truly intend to have anti-inflation strategies baked directly into the river area. There was a tax activist lawsuit that essentially hollowed out the Portland Development Commission's not prosper Portland's funding at the time in order to implement those. And there was also concern from attorneys that prioritizing people based on race would actually break federal anti-discrimination laws. So those things were happening, right? So trying to navigate that. When all of that came to fruition, the contractors had already been selected for the yellow line, right? That's like, it's still awful what happened. So like, that's one specific circumstance. We've learned a lot about that. A lot of the programs that have been experimented with by the city at large have truly not been that successful yet, because they're mostly focusing in those areas where that displacement has already occurred. But there are a lot of different things happening. Like we are working on a citywide strategy to implement anti-displacement approaches and broader coordination between bureaus of actually helping stabilize groups and communities prior to making those investments and prioritizing in that way. But that's a little bit challenging too, because we're talking about areas that are experiencing incredible traffic violence and safety improvements need, right? So it's like balancing priorities becomes a challenge. And in the realm of urban renewal, in Coley, there's actually a urban renewal experiment that's occurring right now that was actually in part started by community advocates there. And it's essentially intended to truly, because Coley is experiencing displacement as a result of rising housing costs elsewhere. They actually were able to create kind of an experimental urban renewal area where a majority of those funds are being used for the provision of affordable housing for this resident. So trying to actually create a stabilization system to keep the diversity there of those people who want to stay.
The page.
So you're talking about anti-displacement. Does people also think about, there are lots of communities in Portland that, since they were built as streetcar suburbs, have basically not changed. I mean, some of them, like Laz Addition is a historic district, but a lot of them are not. Does people, and this might be more ridiculous, like, does people think about, there are lots of areas like we're talking about in East Portland where you're going from like no streets and no trees, massive plots of land, like so super difficult to go from that and say, hey, instead of people getting displaced out here, what if we disrupt some of these communities that have historically been basically completely like insulated from having any change?
No, that's a great question. That's a really challenging one. Property rights are really severe in the United States, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. I don't know. So the city did pass the Course Residential Infill Project. Perhaps its efficacy is questionable, but it's trying to balance those voices of residents who want to maintain a specific quality of life and trying to increase housing choices so that people who can't experience that quality of life have the choice to live in those neighborhoods as well. It's not as fast as I think the city would like it to, but that's one such example.
I think it's also fair to say that in focusing on a question like this, you shouldn't be focusing on PBOT. It is one of the reasons to, whether you like the change of government that's coming or not, that's probably the major reason it is adopted by the voters, was to say, let's not think just about bureau by bureau or infrastructure by infrastructure. We need to think more broadly. And, you know, in some ways, the focus at this point ought to be on making sure that whatever the new setup is, it focuses on that broadness. Sure, I have some ideas about how that. I'm sure we all do. But I think that in some ways that in this next year, there's in 2 years or 3 years, there's going to be a great opportunity to affect that. And in some ways, now is the time to think about it. And let me just use one sort of transportation example, and that is the reason East Portland doesn't have sidewalks is because it was all in the county, and the county didn't require them to put it in. In most of the city did require them to put it in. Those improvements are made at the time the development first happens. Laz Addition hasn't gotten new sidewalks. They got sidewalks at the very beginning. East Portland didn't. Well, how do you change the rules to make that more fair in the future? You know, that's a really tough equity question. And because right now the rules are that the people who live there have to pay for it.
Yeah, transportation infrastructure, like real hardy transportation infrastructure, is fast or none at least. And that's why I think in Portland, you see a lot of these interim treatments or these softer treatments that we put places. A lot of them do stuff, understandably so. And we do them because we're trying to affect as much shade as possible with as little money as possible. That's not ideal, but sidewalks are very expensive. But what Steve was saying, like, yes, like what PBOT controls is the right of way, the public space, which we put, as my presentation showed, these systems overlap, of course, it's an urban system. And the government changes is a really good opportunity to consider that. We try to coordinate as much as possible, but we are kind of actors right now, so.
We'll be cautious of time. I know we only have 5 minutes left, but as I remember Paige had a question, so shall we take one more question?
So as all these developments are happening in Portland, Seattle is right up north, and I'm sure, you know, redlining is happening there. I'm just curious if there were any connections. I know that Seattle is slightly more like racially diverse than Portland is. Were there any connections that were moving from Portland to Seattle, or was it basically just as exclusive as Portland at a certain time?
I would say historically they're pretty close together.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that Washington didn't have a constitutional limitation on who could live there. If you look at the 1890 population statistics for both places, Oregon actually had more colored people than Washington did, even though Washington's population was much larger. So what you know, I mean, you mentioned that people came here anyway from different groups, despite the rules. I'm not really sure.
That was hard to answer why specific groups end up settling in specific spaces. Of course, I think in around Seattle, they grew it into Detroit much more quickly eventually.
Yeah.
Of course, so those enclaves of specific cultural groups and communities become much larger, and so they become very normalized places, I think, for people, just from an anecdote.
When people do move out to the Pacific Northwest, those are the 2 cities in the area. So usually it's one that's open. Anyway, we are almost at time. I want to thank you, all of you, for being here. For some reason, I really appreciate today's class. I feel like we need to have a class like this towards the beginning, maybe at week 2 versus week 3, just kind of set the stone. But this sets the stage for next week's class, because we've got Dan Bauer and Alan Lato coming to talk about short-term background in the system and where it is now. So that's what we have going on for next week. There are a few things that I do want to bring up, which is the field trip that we had planned, that we had talked about, and yeah, can you bring this up? So this is what we had, we'll zoom this up a little so I can read this. So we had the Oregon Rail Heritage Center. So these are the voting that took place during the week. And I think what the top 3 is one walking toward 82nd Avenue in the J District topped. The second is the Division Street FX2 transit project. I can talk about that project. And then the other one is the 15 line to Montgomery Park to talk about streetcar extension. So those top. The other one is streetcar or TriMet call center operations headquarters. So I think I need to have a conversation with the powers to be here in the city and who can lead what, but it sounds like if we were to do a walking tour of 82nd Avenue in the J District, we could supplement that and also include Division and a part of that, because 82nd and Division intersects, and that I've worked pretty heavily on that project over the last couple of years, so I can help lead that project, that walk. But if we want to talk about the bus line to Montgomery Park or even the TriMet call center, I would pose that as a question to next week's presenter as to what may happen, so that we can take care of that next week. I don't know what we could do in terms of the call center or operations headquarters. I haven't even done that.
How much time is the field trip?
Usually the field trip is a Saturday and it takes, I'm gonna say 3 to 4 hours. We haven't decided on what weekend we're gonna do this, and I might need somebody to help me lead this, if we were to do this, but I wanna see, do we wanna do it in second in the J district?
No. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I'm sorry?
I cannot do it.
Yeah,
That long.
yeah, I realize that.
I wonder, we haven't talked much about like what the goals might be. We're talking about like ideas of what to do, but less about like what are you hoping to be taking away from, like you're hoping to have a touristy experience, or you're hoping having a equity experience, or hoping like, it feels hard to make a decision on what to do with that.
Well, the basis of the class is really for you to learn more about the transportation system here. And the goal of the field trip is to get us out on the streets to see how some of the inner workings of these street lights or new ped crossing, to see it in action. The reason why 82nd always talks for a tour is because it's a project that's happening right now with the city, but it's also for you to be on the street to realize how much traffic there is out there and how hard it is to cross the street and how diverse the country is. The country, yes, the street is, but, so that's kind of like just being boots on the ground to see and feel and experience. Or where you're living or other people living out in the Southwest, just being able to be in a part of what used to be the edge of the city, which is now the center of the city. So that's essentially my goal, to lead us in a field trip.
We'll definitely get that in the work with your second half.
We can definitely take that, and it's been a popular one, yes.
But it depends on how much walking a person does.
I wonder if we could like, I was just on a bike tour where like Kyle Johnson, who runs a pedicab company, if we could just hire him to also pedicab some folks and actually walk and creative.
Yeah, we can think on that. Any other ideas, perspectives, thoughts? Yeah. We have to look at weekends, yeah, we'll have to look at calendars, but.
So are you saying that, those top three you just mentioned that got 7, 8, 9 votes, you'll make the decision based on who can help run them, and that's the decision rather than like a revote?
Yeah.
I just want to, we should shoot a little choice, right?
Brand choice?
We're all gonna hear most of that, right?
Okay,